Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 7 of the Cyber Career Lab. I thank you for joining me for another episode. For those of you who are new to the program, the Cyber Career Lab was created for people who cannot afford thousands of dollars for degree programs or for certification training. The guided lessons that have been developed expose beginning, intermediate, and even advanced professionals to relevant content that equips them to be successful in their cybersecurity careers. The goal is to deliver content in an hour or less using engaging sessions, great instructors, not just including me, but also guest lecturers and other industry professionals who all donate their time and their talents to make sure that everybody in the workforce understands what they need to know, how they need to operate, and how they need to deliver services to provide value for their organizations. For season 1, we've been talking about professionalism and perspective in cybersecurity, and many of the topics have focused on risk management because risk management is the foundation of how cybersecurity really operates. The why behind the question really is we're doing cybersecurity so that we can reduce risk to an acceptable level for the organizations that we serve and support. Now, for this week, for this session, the goal is to review concepts because next week we'll talk about risk reporting, and it's important that you have a good foundational understanding about how risk management works and how you contribute to the success of the risk management programs within your organization. As you'll notice from one of the previous sessions, the approach to risk management is always the same. The diagram that you see highlights a standard risk management approach that is going to be valid and effective whether you're talking about project risk, enterprise risk, financial risk, or anything else that you can think of. Understanding the entire process is important for conducting risk assessments, for analyzing the results, for recommending risk treatment, for accepting the risk, and then providing communication and monitoring and review and feedback about the program and how it's operating. Now, as you'll see when we go forward, there are multiple ways to also treat risk, but one of the things that I wanted to highlight in this session is that we still are following the same approach regardless of the framework that we're using. And so one of the items that is on everybody's mind in the profession and in the business world is digital transformation. You have a lot of organizations that are going from legacy infrastructure to cloud services, where they're going from client server infrastructure to virtualized infrastructure. And so digital transformation does not always mean that you're going to go to the cloud, but there's always some aspect of changing the way that you're using information technology, infrastructure, network communications, and digital resources to support the business processes that an organization depends upon to deliver its products, services, or results. The reason that I selected Deloitte's digital risk framework is because their framework aligns very well with digital transformation initiatives. And when they put the framework together and reported on it on a white paper in 2018, they highlighted that there was consideration about 10 risk areas that are listed in the slide. So if you start at the top, I'm a fan of strategy, and I think it is appropriate to begin with this topic, but you start with your strategic initiatives, your technology initiatives, third-party risk, data leakage, regulatory requirements, forensics, resilience, privacy, cyber, and operations. And all of these critical areas work together and must be taken into consideration so that an organization understands the nature and the level of digitization that's required in their operations, as most of these areas are at an early stage and tightly coupled with systems, manual processes, and the transformation effort in general. And so when you're looking at risk management, if I go back a slide, the idea is not just that you're going to focus on the framework and the model and you establish scope and you do a risk assessment and then you do risk treatment and then you do risk acceptance, but is that you understand how the risk management framework applies to real business situations and real business initiatives. And this short focus on digital transformation is a good way to get your brain thinking. Now, when you think about those 10 risk areas, whether we're focusing on digital transformation or anything else that an organization does, as part of our review, it's important to reinforce the idea that risk treatment is a business decision. The business is ultimately in control and has the power to make all the decisions about how they're going to treat the risk, whether you're going to accept the risk, mitigate the risk, avoid the risk, or transfer the risk. It is always going to be the business owner who has the power, the influence, and the ability to direct and manage resources that are going to be applied to your risk treatment plan. Now, when you talk about risk being a business decision, another thing to consider based on the things that we've talked about is where in the organization those risk decisions are going to be made. Under many circumstances, the CIO or the CISO is put in a position to say, how are we going to treat the risk? How are we going to respond to it? What are we going to do about the thing that we found? Under ideal circumstances, risk management should be a part of the entire fabric of the organization, and there are different decisions that happen at different levels. The way that the NIST risk management framework in special publication 800-39 describes risk, it exists as a tiered organizational hierarchy where when you're operating from the top down, it has a strategic approach, and when you operate from the bottom up, it has a tactical approach, but it provides the opportunity to explore risk from multiple dimensions and from multiple perspectives within the organization. Now, what generally happens, as I said, is that one small group in the organization becomes responsible for all of the risk management decisions, and those people that are making the decisions are usually disconnected from the drivers of the business or things that the organization finds important. As an example, the CIO often does not know the revenue goals for every business unit within the organization. The CIO doesn't know the drivers that influence the revenue goals, the targets, or the way that everybody's operating. The CIO is just focused on the uptime and the availability of digital systems so that business users, business units, business analysts, and everybody else within the organization can produce the outcome that they're looking for. It is much more effective when you start at tier 1 at the organization level, where the board of directors and the senior executive staff and the chief executive officer define the acceptable boundaries for risk taking. In this approach, it's the senior leaders of the organization that say, what is the risk appetite? How far are we willing to go? How much are we willing to use? And how much are we willing to lose in pursuit of our business goals and our business objectives? Then, using this NIST model from the organization level, those decisions that are made by the board and the senior executive team and the chief executive officer then influence what the leaders at the mission and business process level are doing. And so at tier 2 is often where you have the CIO, the CISO, the person in charge of sales and marketing. Your general counsel might exist at tier 2. All of these senior vice presidents and senior executives that are in charge of and leading business units within the organization exist at tier 2, and they take as input the decisions that were made at tier 1 to ensure that everything that happens in their department or in their area or in their division is managed according to the plan that was defined by the organization. It is only at tier 3 where you start to have your technology specialists and your security specialists, and where the CIO and the CISO do a lot of their work to support the organization. This is the level where you start focusing on specific information systems that work together to support the business goals and objectives. Again, as I said when we started this slide, most of your risk treatment decisions are happening at tier 3 without any involvement of business leadership or the organization at tier 1 and tier 2. And at tier 3, that is the wrong place for the risk appetite statement to be defined, for the boundaries and the risk capacity that defines the maximum amount of risk that the organization can absorb. And so you want to make sure that everybody is involved in the process. If you're early in your career and you're at the beginning of your cybersecurity journey, most of the people who meet that definition are going to be operating at tier 3, but you can't say that you have no business understanding or being familiar with what's going on at the levels above you. Again, within the model, the people at tier 3 are working tactically, but you're using the information that's provided strategically at tier 1 and tier 2 to drive your activities. And it also helps you understand what are you doing and why are you doing it and what value does it have for the business. And so the tiered risk management approach is going to be a key component in the risk treatment decisions that are made by the organization, so that an organization has the opportunity to manage risk in a way that reflects their drivers, their initiatives, and their objectives. Another component of risk management is understanding context. Although the organization at Tier 1 and the mission and business functions at Tier 2 are going to make decisions about how to manage risk and what risk to accept, and whether that risk acceptance or risk treatment or risk transfer or risk avoidance is going to take place, all of that really boils down to the context and the impact of those decisions on the business. And so if you take everything as an equation, what you're combining is the risk management framework with the tiered organizational hierarchy, and to that you're going to add the business context that drives all of the decisions, so that you understand what is the best approach to use to make a risk-based decision about the treatment options that we have available. When we talk about resilience, we're really talking about operations. And this is what I defined in previous sessions as the 4 R's of risk. And so any risk that is going to influence the operation of the business needs to be considered. And then at Tier 1 and Tier 2, within the risk management framework, the business is going to decide how much of an operational outage are we willing to accept before we start to avoid risk, transfer risk, or mitigate the risk by putting controls in place. And then the same question applies to revenue, to regulations, and to reputation, where revenue represents acceptable levels of financial losses because of an outage that is caused by a cybersecurity attack. And so you think about things like the SolarWinds breach, or the breach that happened over the Independence Day holiday in the United States, or even going all the way back to the Target breach. Any kind of breach is always going to have some impact on revenue. And if you're using something like factor analysis of information risk, also known as the FAIR model, it gives you the opportunity to not only think about the direct impact of a breach, but also secondary impacts, all related to finances and revenue that an organization is going to lose because some outage or cybersecurity event occurred. Now, regulations often have a financial impact, so revenue touches on many concerns, but regulations are things that are driven by a regulatory body, like Brussels for GDPR, or Washington, D.C. for national regulations, or even at a state level in the United States, you have things like the California Consumer Protection Act, or you have a new privacy regulation that's coming out in Virginia next year. There are all kinds of regulatory bodies, but the risk management decisions that you're making are based upon the regulations that define how your business operates in the location that it exists. So if I'm a state level company, I only have to worry about state regulations. As an example, if I operated in Illinois and I collected personal information from consumers, I would have to comply with the US Privacy Act. I would have to comply with the Illinois Personal Information Protection Act and the Illinois Biometric Information Protection Act. And for all of those acts, if I have a data breach related to the requirements of the regulation, then we're going to suffer some negative consequence. And so knowing your regulations is as important as the lost revenue that you might realize, or the downtime from your systems being offline as a result of the breach. And then all of these items could have a direct relationship to your reputation, or it could have a completely separate impact on the reputation of the organization. When we talk about reputation, reputation is interesting because it doesn't immediately stand out as a risk that is on the same level as operational resilience, revenue, or regulations, but reputation influences whether or not people are going to want to continue to do business with your organization. Now, when I was a college professor, one of the experiments or research areas that I had my students look at was the impact of a breach on the reputation of an organization using the stock price of publicly traded companies. And so it seemed like a great idea at the time. In a lot of cases, if you looked at 12 financial quarters that represents 3 years, or you start looking at more and more financial quarters and you measure the distance between the breach and the number of years that passed after the breach, you often have a situation where most publicly traded companies temporarily suffer consequences of a breach, and then everything goes back to normal once people have forgotten about it. One, because so many breaches happen, and two, because there's a lot of other activity that happens in the marketplace, and people don't tend to focus on the same company for too long. The issue with that approach and using that to measure reputation is it doesn't take into account switching costs. And so a very large publicly traded company that does not have a lot of competitors is going to suffer less reputational harm than a small or medium business that has a ton of competitors in the marketplace and needs to protect its reputation so that consumers don't lose confidence for doing business with them. So the example that I used in a previous session focused on the impact of the data breach on Equifax when they really only have two competitors in the marketplace. It is not very easy in a business-to-business relationship to switch from Equifax to TransUnion or to switch from Equifax to the other competitor in that space because there are really only three competitors. But if you are a small or medium business that did professional services in the city of Atlanta, you could have thousands of competitors. And so the switching costs and the number of competitors in the marketplace often has a huge impact on reputation. Similarly, the type of business that you have could influence the value of your reputation and the risk that you're trying to manage. For example, if I'm a bank, financial services take their reputation very seriously because people might not do business with the bank. They can't protect personal information or financial information. And so it reinforces the idea that banks invest a lot of time, resources, and energy to protect the data that they have because their reputations are very important. But then you have other organizations that don't depend on their reputation for their revenue and are a little less hesitant to invest all of their resources to prevent reputational harm.